You're trying to solve a big problem. Nothing seems to work. Hold up. Before you waste more time, you should consider a problem-solving framework called the monkey and the pedestal. It comes out of X, the innovation factory, where Alphabet, Google's parent company, takes its most ambitious bets, and it will save you a lot of time. I've used it myself, especially when I was leading teams at Google, where we were all too eager to dive into work. But by applying this framework, we've saved ourselves weeks, even months of time. And as a result, our efforts had a much better chance of succeeding. So here's how it works. Imagine getting a crazy assignment at work. You must teach a monkey to recite Shakespeare while standing on a pedestal. Now ask yourself, what's the first thing you should do? Build the pedestal. That sounds logical. The pedestal is what we call low-hanging fruit, the small, easy stuff that we love to tackle first because it gives us a sense of progress. But that's the wrong answer. There is no point in building pedestals if you can't solve for the monkey, writes behavioral researcher Annie Duke, whom I first learned this from. Because, sure, you could build an amazing pedestal, but what's the point if a monkey can't learn to recite Shakespeare on it? In other words, the monkey and the pedestal are two different kinds of solutions. The monkey is the pivotal part of any problem, and if you don't solve for the monkey, nothing else you do matters. The pedestal is everything else you do to solve the problem, often because it's easier, less scary, or more obvious than the monkey. Now here's our biggest obstacle. When we take on big projects, we often have no idea what the hardest part is. That's the point of this exercise. You must step back and ask yourself, what's my monkey? Before you go hunting for yours, it's helpful to hear how other people found theirs. So here are a few examples. Astro Teller, the CEO of X, once wrote about an interesting example. His team tried turning seawater into carbon-neutral liquid fuel, which is a potential game-changer of an idea. But before they spent too much time on it, they asked themselves, what's the monkey here? You might think it's the technology that turns seawater into fuel, because that sounds hard. Surprisingly, it's not. The tech is relatively straightforward, Teller writes, which makes it the pedestal. Instead, the monkey was this. Can seawater fuel be made cheap enough for people to buy it? Because if that's not possible, there's no point in developing the technology. Ultimately, X realized the answer was no. The economics of the concept didn't work, so it killed the project. Here's another example, on a smaller scale. I was recently talking with an entrepreneur named Stephanie, who co-founded a food brand with her cousin. It's gone okay, but not as great as she hoped, so she's been exploring a pivot, doing endless research, calling many experts, and stressing herself out. Before we dug into the specifics, I asked what her goal was. Well, I want to pivot, she said. Okay, but you can't pivot until you solve this, I said. She looked confused. What? Your cousin, I said. He's the monkey. Stephanie and her cousin both have very strong opinions about how the business should go. They've been wanting to pivot for months, but neither wants to give an inch. As a result, they've been stuck. Meanwhile, Stephanie has been pulling her hair out, trying to make it happen on her own. Pivots may be hard, but they also completely achievable. But Stephanie will never achieve a pivot until she's resolved the tension with her cousin. That must be solved before anything else. Now, you see, the monkey isn't always obvious, but it's always critical. The monkey represents the single most important thing you need to do to make progress. But it's hard to figure out what that is, because we're biased toward the obvious. To help you do it, I suggest asking this question. If I solved this problem, and it was a great success, what major change would have gotten me there? In other words, what bottleneck did you clear out? What critical hurdle did you overcome? That's your monkey. This helps you break through analysis paralysis and stop wasting time on the wrong parts of a problem. When we were at Google, we used it like this. Say we wanted to launch a new product. We wouldn't start planning months of marketing campaigns or making mock-ups of the app. Instead, we would huddle and try to answer, what's the monkey? Is the monkey that we need to hire 50 engineers to write 10,000 lines of code? Then we would spend our time accordingly. Of course, sometimes you don't know what the monkey is right away, so you have to hunt for it. For example, one of my friends started a business and he was struggling to grow. He tried a ton of tactics, none of which worked. He kept hitting his head against the wall until he asked himself, if I solve this problem and it's a huge success, what would that look like? Would I have more customers, more profits? Well, yes, but also this, a simpler, more elegant solution. And then it hit him. The whole thing was way too complicated. He was trying to boil the ocean. His solution wasn't to keep grinding away on the same approach, but to drastically simplify. And once he did, his business took off. Once you've identified the monkey, it's still not enough. You have to actually go after it. But now you have a clear shot. You're going for the heart of the matter, the single most impactful thing you can do instead of spinning your wheels on the periphery. In fact, there's a great story about this from X, the Moonshot Factory. One of their early projects was trying to prevent malaria in Africa. The team spent 6 months researching, traveling, interviewing experts, and they thought they had the answer. More investment in existing solutions. So they built a pedestal, a proposal for how to use data to distribute bed nets to people at risk for malaria. But after months of work, they realized it wasn't having an impact. So they went back to basics. What's the monkey? They realized it wasn't distributing nets. It was preventing mosquitoes from entering homes in the first place. After all, you can't get malaria if you aren't bitten by a mosquito. So they pivoted from there and started testing different kinds of window screens. That new approach led to a patent and a startup called Equitable, which is now working to eradicate malaria in Africa. Think about how much time, energy, and money they wasted on the pedestal. But without solving for the monkey first, the entire project would have failed. Now, it's not always this easy to spot the monkey. Sometimes it requires creativity or a new perspective. So it helps to have some distance. For example, years ago, I was interning at a hospital, trying to figure out why so many patients fell through the cracks. I talked to doctors, nurses, patients, and more. I was so deep in the weeds, but then one day, I stepped back and thought, what would someone with no medical experience conclude? And that gave me the space to think differently. That's when I had the idea to design a bracelet that reminds patients to take their medications, which became the foundation for a startup called Ginger. We're wired to get lost in the details. So don't be afraid to zoom out, get some perspective, and just ask yourself, what's the monkey? Of course, this isn't a perfect framework. There are other useful ways to approach problems. But this one is powerful because it forces you to focus on what matters. Now, related to this, there's another idea that helped me dramatically improve my ability to solve problems and make decisions. It's from a book called Thinking in Bets, and to learn about that idea, you'll have to watch this video next. See you there.